And of course, what I'm talking about is that it's better to give than to receive. Because I don't think we believe it for a second, do we? Does it feel better for you to give than receive? You know, it feels so good to receive, you know. I don't know if you were empathizing there with Ben as he's giving those gifts to himself, and yeah, that would feel nice to get a new pair of shoes. That would feel great. I'm not saying that it doesn't feel good to give, but better. It's better to give than receive. Let me give you an example. If I was to say to you that I have a Ferrari and I'd love to give it to you, or you could give that Ferrari to someone else and you get nothing, what do you think would be better? I think it would totally be better to receive than to give. And yet, here I am today, up here, about to talk to you about the joy in giving. And maybe when you hear about joy in giving in a church context, you know, you immediately think about this statement, you know, that I don't think many of us actually believe is true. You know, Trav's going to get up here and tell me that it feels better to give than to receive. We're just all going to agree with that. You know, that sacrifice and service just feels really good. And, you know, for some people, that might be true. You know, it feels good to sacrifice for your family and the people that you love. But I suspect for many of us that there's not much joy in the idea of sacrifice, of giving up. And so I want to suggest a better expression of giving this year, a biblical expression of giving. And now that we're a little bit older and wiser here in this room, you seem smart and switched on, I think you can handle it. This expression is, when we've received much, then giving is a joy and we have much to give. Let me give you an example. If I had 10 Ferraris to give to you, do you think it'd be easier to give 1 or 9 of those Ferraris to someone else? When we have received much, then giving is a joy and we have much to give. I heard just this past week, actually, a person called Mackenzie Scott, who's the ex-wife of the Amazon founder, Jeff Bezos. The ex-wife, Mackenzie Scott, has donated more than $4 billion these past 4 months. Just these past 4 months, 4 with billions after it. That's huge. And then I read on and saw that Scott herself has a net worth of more than $60 billion. It's still huge, but when you have received much, then giving is a joy. And we have much to give. And, you know, I know and you know that sometimes it can be really hard to be joyful in giving. And I think that there's 2 reasons that can be the case. We're going to cover those as we go through our passage today. The first reason I think it can be a struggle for it to be a joy for us is that maybe we think that giving is about giving as much as everyone else. You know, I need to be giving the same as someone else to be truly giving, which it can just make us feel like giving is something that we're compelled to do. You know, I have to do it a certain way, or I have to do it a certain amount. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that maybe we forget how much we've received from God. You know, when we forget that we've already received forgiveness, then giving can feel like a way to earn that forgiveness, which is never the right reason to give, and it's not going to bring any joy to try and earn your forgiveness. So we're going to address these 2 things as we go on in our passage, and we're going to look at what the Bible actually says about joyful giving and what it actually looks like. So I hope you have your passage open, maybe on your devices. It's also going to be up on the screen if that's a struggle for you. Maybe you want to use your devices or your books there to write some notes. That would be a good thing. We're going to look at the text in Philippians chapter 2, a letter to the church in Philippi written by the Apostle Paul. And we're going to begin in verse 17. And Paul says, "Even if I'm being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and service coming from your faith, I am glad and rejoice with all of you. Now, what a strange passage to choose to talk about joy in giving. It's so weird, isn't it? There's sacrifice, there's a drink offering. We're going to go through this. It's not entirely clear from this passage what sacrifice and service he's referring to. If you've got the Bible open, even in context, it's not so clear. And we can see in chapter 4, verse 10 to 19, there's a glimpse of a specific sacrifice from the Philippians that he might be referring to here. And in chapter 4, verse 10, we'll see it on the screen in a sec. Here we see that they served Paul out of their love and sharing in his troubles. And they share in giving and receiving. We see that in verse 15 as well. And it's in verse 18 where Paul uses the terminology of sacrifice when he's speaking of their gift. And he says, I'm amply supplied. Now that I've received from Epaphroditus the gifts that you sent, they are a fragrant offering, an acceptable sacrifice, pleasing to God. This is the service that their faith produced, not an obedience to a command from Paul, not an obligation to his requests. This is Paul, we better do it. But they renewed their concern for Paul as they gave as an expression of their faith, which is what we saw Paul say back in chapter 2, verse 17. The sacrifice and service that's coming from their faith. And it's so interesting in chapter 4 that Paul mentions that he didn't really need their gifts or even desire them. He's not slighting their generosity, but he says he didn't need it and he didn't ask for it because that's not the point. The point is that the Philippians are expressing their faith. That God has given them all that they need, and that it's a joy for them to then give to others out of that abundance. And this is true of our giving as well. We shouldn't be giving of our time and our talents and treasures because we're compelled to. We shouldn't be giving just because there's need or a gap in the roster. Because Paul is content without the Philippians' gifts. He says he, knows what it is to be in need and what it is to have plenty, and he's found a way to be content in all circumstances. And Paul doesn't need that, and God doesn't need our giving. He doesn't need our money to do the things that he wants to do. Saying it out loud, it sounds absurd, doesn't it? If God just had an extra $20, man, the things he could do. God's been doing his thing here and achieving stuff in this church and in this world without you and me around, and he's going to keep doing it. It's not God that misses out, it's us. And we've been given so much. We've been given forgiveness in Jesus. We've been given eternal riches that won't perish or fade. We've been given eternal life. Peace with God. We've been given a church family that we can belong to and trust ourselves with. We've been given purpose, living as disciples. We've been given a promise that we'll one day enter God's rest. I could go on and on and on of all the things that we have received from God. And never more is there a time to hear all these things than Christmas time, right? The gift that we have been given as God sent his son into the world. Again, we've heard this in the kids' talk. We have been given so much. And when we give to others, it doesn't diminish anything for us. It doesn't lessen what God has given to us. It can't. God's not that stingy. And so when we give of our time and tell others about Jesus and offer them the gift of life we've received, it doesn't detract from the grace that God's given us. When we remember that we've received so much, giving doesn't leave us empty, because our giving doesn't diminish anything that God has generously given us. And so for the Philippians, their sacrifice and their service came from their faith, from out of a genuine response to what God has done for them. And so a helpful question, you might want to jot this down. This is something you might want to think about later, reflect on, as I said, if you're taking notes, is to think about maybe what's coming from your faith. You know, have you renewed concern for someone else like the Philippian church did? Have you shared in someone else's troubles? Are you sharing in the giving and receiving of gifts within the church? Not just financially, but time and the skills that you have, just being with someone. And maybe you're giving, but it's not coming from your faith, and that might be a challenge for you today. You know, it's coming from a sense of obligation or guilt. Or maybe you're just going through a season that you need to remember how much you've received in the Lord. Because when we've received much, then giving is a joy, and we have much to give. So you might want to reflect on that a little bit later after the talk. Well, we've covered what the sacrifice and service coming from your faith in verse 17 might be about, but what about Paul's being poured out like a drink offering? What a weird phrase that is. You know, in another letter in 2 Timothy 4, Paul talks about being poured out as a drink offering then as well. So he loves this phrase, but then he's talking about it in terms of his imminent death in 2 Timothy chapter 4, talking about it in terms of his imminent death. But that doesn't seem to be the case here. He doesn't seem to be talking about his death or his suffering in the context of what he's writing here to the Philippians. And what Paul is referring to in both of these uses of the language is a part of the Old Testament sacrificial system. And we find that a drink offering is something to accompany the burnt offering. If you want to look this up later, you'll find it in Numbers chapter 15, verses 1 to 10. And in it, you see that there's a burnt offering of a lamb, and then you're also to add some drink offering to that with wine. And there's a burnt offering of a bull, and then add some drink offering to that. And there's a burnt offering and add some wine. And so Paul uses this language to talk about a drink offering in this sacrificial system that accompanies the burnt offering. And so Paul doesn't seem to be talking about his death or martyrdom here, but what he seems to be suggesting from the use of this term is that he's accompanying their expression of their faith. He's the drink offering that's poured out on top of their sacrifice and service coming from their faith, which means that, as he says, he's glad and he rejoices with them. Which is just so great, I think. You know, that he's accompanying their expression of their faith. And that's what it means when giving enables others to contribute as they participate in receiving the gift. Here, Paul is saying that he is poured out just like a drink offering would on top of their sacrifice and the service coming from their faith. All of this as an offering to God, to give glory to God, to serve God, and their giving enables him to participate in their service by receiving it and thanking God for it, by boasting in God for it, as he says in verse 16 of the same chapter. It's so great that this is what giving enables. When we've received much, then giving is a joy, and we have much to give, and we can all participate. Everyone gets to participate. It's so good. And so far we've seen that giving is an expression of our faith, of the inward reality of what God's done for us. But it's more than that. The manner in which we give is also important. You know, it's not just the joy that's in here. And we see this from the previous verses in Philippians chapter 2. We're going to jump back to verses 14 and 15, where Paul says, "Do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation." So interesting. Do everything without grumbling and arguing. Ugh. Do I have to? I don't know what your response is. Like, why? Why do I have to do this? Isn't it important that the thing gets done? Can't we just be task-oriented people? You know, can we just have a little whinge when we get home? Well, I don't know about you, but this word from God has been such a great rebuke for me this week.